Hello, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I want to discuss a distinction that was commonly made throughout the medieval period and all the way back to the classical period in philosophy, dating back at least to Aristotle. Probably earlier, if we're willing to be a bit more loose with our definitions. And that is the distinction between imagination and understanding. Now, we might today use these terms more or less synonymously, but our predecessors had very distinct meanings for the two terms, and this distinction was very important for a lot of arguments that were made by philosophers at the time. To illustrate this point, I'm going to go through one such argument that I've discussed elsewhere, and that is Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, and more specifically, how he replies to Gaunilo's criticism of his argument. Now, Gaunilo was another monk who was a correspondent of his, so he is working from within the same intellectual tradition, and he is a charitable critic, someone who is trying to help Anselm to refine his ideas rather than to tear them apart or undermine or defeat them. And so, Gaunilo presents what he sees as a problem with Anselm's ontological argument, his argument for the existence of God, based on the definition of God as that than which no greater can be conceived, or we might say no greater can be understood to exist. And so Gaunilo proposes a story of what he calls the lost island. We can substitute this in as that island than which no greater can be thought, or conceived, or understood. He says, the island, so the story goes, is more plentifully endowed than even the Isles of the Blessed, with an indescribable abundance of all sorts of riches and delights, and because it is neither owner nor inhabitant, it is everywhere superior in its abundant riches to all the other lands that human beings inhabit. Suppose someone tells me all this story is easily told, involves no difficulty, and so I understand it. Now I'm adding here, he's claiming that we understand it. Anselm is going to go on to argue that we do not actually understand what is being said here, what is being talked about, what is being discussed. We do not understand the concept of the lost island, or that island than which no greater can be thought. Rather, we can only imagine it, or we can picture it. Now, going back to Gaunilo's description, he goes on to explain that if this were the case, then we could follow Anselm's reasoning, and therefore prove that such an island, this perfect island, must exist not only in the understanding, but also in reality, because it is better to exist in reality, not only in the understanding. This goes to point to an apparent flaw in Anselm's reasoning, because it uses the same method of argument and the same premises, altered slightly so that we're talking about that island than which no greater can be thought, rather than that simpliciter than no greater can be thought, that being God, and comes to an obviously false conclusion, since he puts forward, this island certainly does not exist. Now, we also find parallel modern objections to Anselm's ontological argument, or to other ontological arguments. We find people arguing today, usually atheist philosophers, or perhaps even just atheist commentators, who bring up arguments that attribute to Anselm the idea that he is, quote, defining God into existence. And they'll bring up similar analogies, something where they will define something like a unicorn, for example, as a horse-like creature with a horn which exists necessarily, and so therefore attributing the divine attributes to a creature, to a finite creature. And this encounters the same problem that Gaunilo in his Lost Island encounters. And that is precisely that such a finite creature, whether that's an island or a unicorn or whatever else, if it is attributed the divine attributes, the infinite attributes, whether that is any of the unqualified perfections, including necessary being, necessary existence, it becomes self-contradictory and therefore inconceivable. It cannot be understood, even if it can be what we would technically call imagined. Now, what is this difference? We may have gleaned something of this difference from how I've been discussing and using the two terms so far, but now I should probably be more explicit. Understanding is purely mental thought. It is understanding something in concept. It is grasping the essence of what it is to be a particular thing. Imagination, on the other hand, is mental imagery. It is the creation and manipulation of what Aristotle called phantasms. That is echoes or imitations of sense experience. So if I tell you to think of the perfect island, and you imagine Neverland, for example, to use the example I've had on screen, then I can begin to ask questions about that island. For example, how many trees are there? You have an answer? Probably not. Now, you could maybe come up with an answer. However, it would be somewhat arbitrary, and it would not actually give you a great making quality, or an unqualified perfection, we should say. I can continue the question. How many miles of coastline does this island have? What's its population? Who in particular is it populated by? Any real island has real, particular answers to these specific questions, because it is the kind of thing that has trees, coastlines, population or lack of a population, and any population is made up of specific people, not just a generic number or a generic population of innumerable size. By asking questions like these, St. Anselm points out that any idea or concept that we think we have of a particular thing, a finite thing, of infinite qualities, whether that's perfection or whether that is an abundance of resources and infinite resources, that sort of thing, anything like this, that as soon as we try to pin down any details of that particular thing, we wind up noticing that our definition is either unclear, as is usually the case, or self-contradictory. In the case of it being self-contradictory, we might ask, well, what if the island had 1 additional mile of coastline? Would that not be better? Could you not walk for an extra few minutes along this extra mile of coastline? Would it not provide more variety to the island itself? It seems that we're almost forced to say, yes, it would be better if the island had a little bit more to it. And then we would be forced to ask the same question once again. Would it not be better if it had yet another mile of coastline? And another, and another, and another, infinitely. This problem comes to a head once we realize what we are defining. An island, after all, is a necessarily finite thing. An island is partially defined by the fact that it is surrounded by water. An island with an infinitely long coastline, simply by definition, is infinite in size and therefore is unlimited. It is not limited in by any water or ocean around it. And so, therefore, it's not an island anymore. So our perfect island turns out not to be an island at all, and therefore is not the perfect island. The perfect island is not the perfect island, and therefore we have an explicit logical contradiction arising from the fact that our initial concept, or what we thought was a concept, of the perfect island was merely an image. It was only a phantasm. It was not something that was real in concept. It was not made up of clear ideas. Now, moving forward through history, we have the blurring of this distinction. In a philosopher in particular, named Immanuel Kant in the Enlightenment, thought of all thought, at least all thought that was non-verbal, as consisting of the manipulation of mental images, what Aristotle would call these phantasms. And that this is simply what it means to think about things. If I ask you to think of an island, once again, you will picture an island. You will not think in the abstract of the concept of an island unless you are simply thinking of the sound island made by the word in your particular language. This confusion, of course, has led to all sorts of objections to older ideas and arguments that are completely wrong-headed because they rely on the wrong concepts of conceptualization, understanding, and thought. We can look in the other direction of this as well and look to things that can be understood but cannot be imagined, that cannot exist as images in the mind, at least not coherently and clearly, but certainly can be understood conceptually. We can go to another Enlightenment philosopher who is somewhat earlier in history than Immanuel Kant, that's René Descartes, who came up with the idea of what he called a chiliagon, which is a regular 1,000-sided geometric figure. Now, can you picture it? I'll put one on screen to help, just in case. This is a chiliagon. Of course, visually, at almost any scale, it is indistinguishable from a circle, at least to the human eye. You may have been picturing a chiliagon, or at least thought you were, but you almost certainly cannot be sure that you are picturing a chiliagon, because if I were to ask you to instead picture a 999-sided regular geometric figure, the mental image would probably not change, or if it does, it would change incorrectly, because I could count down from 1,000 all the way down to 3 and get you a triangle, and you almost certainly would have to skip something at some point. In other words, there is no clear mental picture in your mind of a chiliagon, and there can't be. The human mind isn't capable of coming up with an image of something that fine in scale, and certainly something that it hasn't seen before, or it hasn't seen anything analogous to it before. However, we can certainly understand the concept of a chiliagon. We can understand things about it. If I tell you that each side of a chiliagon is 1 centimeter in length, then you can tell me what any other side is, because it's a regular figure, and you know what a regular figure is. You can tell me that any other side will also be 1 centimeter in length. If you did enough math, maybe you could even figure out the interior angles of a chiliagon are 179.64 degrees. Now, maybe you can't think of that in your head, and maybe you'd need to look up some formulas and take out a calculator, but it stands to reason that you could do so based on what you know non-visually about the concept of a 1,000-sided regular polygon. What this illustrates is that there is such a thing as thought or conceptualization, or what we will call understanding, that is apart from and completely distinct from imagination. That is the conjuration and manipulation of mental images. Now, we can flip this around as well, and right back to thinking about Anselm and his argument. And we can think of the concept of God. Now, barring objections of the unknowability of God, as put forward by other philosophers and even contemporaries of Anselm, Anselm at least argues that the idea of God can be conceived, can be understood. Maybe not fully, maybe not completely, but enough so that we can know what we're referring to, and we can understand things about the divine nature. And we can understand that certain things are correctly said of God, and other things are incorrectly said of God. For example, it is true that God is omnipotent. It is not true that God is purple. God, therefore, being perfect in every way, being immaterial, being beyond all creation, can be understood to the degree that we can describe God. However, God cannot be imagined. The incarnation aside, of course. And here we have the last piece of the puzzle. We have the perfect island, or the unicorn, or something like that, which cannot be understood. It cannot exist in the understanding. It's a logical contradiction, on the one hand. We have something like the chiliagon, which cannot be imagined, but can be understood. You cannot picture it, at least not clearly, but you can describe it. You can understand what it means to be that particular kind of thing. And because of that, things like the chiliagon, as well as things like God, can be argued about rationally, in an a priori sense. That is, prior to any kind of experience, prior to any kind of sense perception. And therefore, we can come to conclusions about such things, absent any observation, any data, any empirical analysis, or even any visual representation. All right, thank you. Hopefully, thank you for listening, and I hope that this description and this distinction has clarified some things and has made us perhaps challenged the way that we think about thinking, which is unfortunately something that we modern people tend to do very little of, thinking about our thinking. And hopefully this will give us a chance to do that a little bit more clearly and make some more distinctions in doing so that we can understand exactly what it is that we understand. So once again, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.